The courtroom was packed that day, the air thick with anticipation and the murmurs of the gathered crowd. It was one of those moments when everyone felt something big was about to happen, even though the case itself seemed trivial on paper. A minor infraction, a fine for a parking violation, had brought the defendant to court, yet the attention it drew was anything but minor. The judge, an older man with a stern countenance and piercing blue eyes, entered the room and commanded silence with his mere presence. Judge Gregory Whitman had been known throughout the city for his strict adherence to the letter of the law. To him, justice was black and white, with no room for interpretation or nuance. He was a figure both respected and feared, a man whose rulings rarely left room for debate. The defendant, however, stood in stark contrast to the courtroom's formal decorum. In walked a woman with a quiet grace, her caramel-toned skin radiant against the deep green of her modest dress. She carried herself with an air of confidence, her head held high, as though she were walking into a room full of admirers rather than a place where she might face humiliation. Her name was Eleanor Carter, and although she was there for what seemed to be a minor issue, her presence had clearly unsettled more than a few people. Eleanor's name wasn't unfamiliar. To some, she was a mere curiosity. To others, she was a symbol of resilience, creativity, and cultural pride. Her reputation as a writer, historian, and advocate for marginalized communities had quietly made her a force to be reckoned with. Yet here she was, standing before the law, just like anyone else. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses and glanced at the case file. To him, Eleanor Carter was just another name on a docket, another individual who had broken a rule. He hadn't done his research, nor did he care to. The law didn't discriminate, he believed. It was a universal force that applied equally to everyone. But for the people in that room who recognized Eleanor, there was an unspoken tension, a sense that this wasn't just about a parking fine. As the proceedings began, the judge's tone was clipped and formal, his words precise as he explained the charges against her. "Miss Carter, you have been summoned to this court for failing to pay a parking fine issued 6 months ago. Do you understand the nature of these charges?" Eleanor nodded, her expression calm but unreadable. "I do, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady, almost musical. The judge raised an eyebrow at her composure, clearly unused to defendants who didn't appear at least slightly nervous under his gaze. "Very well," he continued, flipping through the pages of the file. "The fine has accumulated late fees and currently stands at $1,200. Do you have any objections or mitigating circumstances to present before I render judgment?" Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, and for a moment she seemed to be deciding how much of herself to reveal. "Your Honor," she began, "while I respect the rules and the need for accountability, I do believe there's more to this situation than what's written in that file." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't one for theatrics, and her poised demeanor was starting to irk him. "Miss Carter, this is not a platform for speeches. If you have evidence or legal arguments, now is the time to present them." Eleanor paused, glancing briefly at the audience behind her. Among the spectators were journalists, community leaders, and curious onlookers, all waiting to see how the day would unfold. She took a deep breath and turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I intend to pay the fine. But before you pass judgment, I'd like to share a few details about why this situation occurred." The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling his impatience. "Proceed, but be brief," he said, his tone making it clear that he didn't expect much from her explanation. Eleanor began to speak, her words measured and deliberate. She recounted the events leading up to the fine, explaining how she had been returning from a community fundraiser when her car broke down. She parked it in a spot that was technically restricted but far from obstructive. Despite her efforts to resolve the situation promptly, unforeseen delays had compounded the issue. Judge Whitman listened, but his expression remained impassive. To him, it was just another excuse, one he'd heard 100 times before. Yet there was something about Eleanor's calm defiance that gnawed at him. She wasn't pleading or groveling, as so many others did. Instead, she was asserting herself with dignity, challenging him to see her as more than just a name on a piece of paper. As the judge prepared to issue his ruling, Eleanor spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "Your Honor, I've spent my life working to preserve the stories and struggles of those who came before me. I understand the value of rules, but I also understand the power of context. This fine may seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but to some, it represents a deeper issue, one that I hope we can address together." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time Judge Whitman hesitated. There was something about Eleanor's presence that made him question his usual approach. He wasn't sure what it was, a poise, a reputation, or perhaps the faint murmur of support from the crowd, but he couldn't ignore it. And then something unexpected happened. A young reporter in the back of the courtroom stood up, his voice trembling but resolute. "Your Honor, if I may speak," he called out, drawing gasps from the audience. The judge slammed his gavel, his authority reasserted. "This is highly irregular," he barked. "Sit down or you will be removed from this courtroom." But the reporter didn't sit, and neither did the tension in the room. Everyone could sense that this was no longer just about a parking fine. Something bigger was unfolding, something that would change the lives of everyone involved, including Judge Whitman. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that seemed to stretch out endlessly. The young reporter, visibly nervous but determined, kept his gaze fixed on the judge. He wasn't backing down, even as murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd. Elena turned slightly, her calm expression giving way to a flicker of curiosity. She didn't know the man who had spoken up, but there was something about his voice, something raw and genuine, that made her pause. Judge Whitman's face was a storm cloud of annoyance. This was his courtroom, his domain, and interruptions like this were rare. Still, something in the reporter's stance gave him a moment of pause. The judge exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his bench. "You aren't authorized to speak here," he said, his voice low and commanding. "This is a court of law, not a press conference." The young man swallowed hard but didn't sit down. Instead, he held up a small notebook, its edges frayed from use. "Your Honor, I understand," he said, his voice steadying. "But I believe this is important. It's not just about a parking fine. There's a story here that people need to hear." The judge's gavel hovered over the bench, but he hesitated, his instincts telling him there was more to this situation than met the eye. He glanced at Elena, who stood quietly, her gaze now locked onto the reporter. For the first time since the proceedings began, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "Your Honor," Elena interjected gently, her tone respectful but firm. "Perhaps we should hear what he has to say. I believe it might provide some context." The judge's lips tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, least of all by two people in one day. Still, his curiosity was piqued. He gestured for the bailiff to keep order in the courtroom, then nodded curtly. "You have 2 minutes," he said to the reporter, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The young man stepped forward hesitantly, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "My name is Marcus Young," he began, addressing the room as much as the judge. "I'm a journalist for the local paper, and I've been following Ms. Carter's work for years. She's not just another citizen with a parking ticket. She's a historian, an author, and a community advocate. Her contributions have changed lives, especially in this city." Elena shifted slightly, her brow furrowing as Marcus spoke. She didn't interrupt, but her posture suggested a mix of surprise and unease. She wasn't used to being the focus of such public admiration, especially in a setting like this. "Ms. Carter's books," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength, "aren't just about history. They're about identity, about reclaiming stories that have been erased or forgotten. Her work is why people like me understand our roots, our struggles, and our victories. And yet, here she is, being reduced to a line item on a docket." The judge's frown deepened. While he wasn't unfamiliar with passionate speeches, this one had an edge that made him uneasy. It wasn't just about Elena, it was about him, about the system, and about the unseen forces that govern moments like this. "I know this isn't the place for debates," Marcus added quickly, sensing the judge's growing impatience. "But I just wanted to say this. Elena Carter isn't just a defendant. She's a symbol of resilience. And if this court chooses to ignore that, it's not just a legal mistake, it's a moral one." A ripple of murmurs swept through the audience again, louder this time. The judge raised his gavel to restore order, but before he could speak, Elena stepped forward. Her movements were deliberate, her gaze steady as she addressed Marcus. "Mr. Young," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room, "I appreciate your words, truly. But I came here today to face this situation, not to have someone else fight my battles." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Elena raised a hand, silencing him with a small, gracious smile. She turned back to Judge Whitman, her demeanor composed. "Your Honor," she said, "while I didn't expect to become the subject of a public defense, I understand why Mr. Young felt compelled to speak. But let me make one thing clear. I am here because I believe in accountability. Whatever your ruling, I will accept it without hesitation." The judge studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Elena's words carried a quiet strength that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. For years, he had prided himself on his impartiality, his ability to separate emotion from judgment. Yet now, standing before this woman, he felt a weight he hadn't anticipated. He glanced at the file again, as though the neatly typed words could offer him some clarity. But all he saw was the sterile language of bureaucracy, devoid of the humanity that filled the room. Slowly, he set the file down and leaned forward. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice measured, "while I appreciate your sense of responsibility, the law is clear. This court cannot and will not make exceptions based on a person's reputation or contributions." Elena nodded, her expression unchanging. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Your Honor," she replied. The judge hesitated again, his gaze flicking briefly to Marcus, then back to Elena. "However," he added, his tone softening slightly, "this court also recognizes the importance of context. I will take your circumstances into account before issuing a final decision." The crowd murmured again, this time with a mix of relief and curiosity. The judge's words left much to interpretation, and the tension in the room remained palpable. Elena inclined her head in acknowledgement, her calm exterior betraying none of the uncertainty she felt. As she stepped back to her place, she caught Marcus' eye. He gave her a small, apologetic shrug, as if to say he couldn't help himself. Despite her earlier rebuke, she felt a flicker of gratitude. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, signaling that the proceedings were far from over. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced. "When we return, I will deliver my ruling." The bailiff called for order as the room erupted into hushed conversations. Elena remained still, her thoughts a whirl of conflicting emotions. She had come prepared to face judgment, but the day had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. As the courtroom emptied for the recess, Marcus approached her cautiously. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice low, "I'm sorry if I overstepped. I just couldn't stay silent." Elena studied him for a moment, then offered a small, weary smile. "You meant well," she said simply, "but next time, let me handle it." Marcus nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. "For what it's worth," he added, "I think you've already won, whether the judge realizes it or not." Elena didn't respond, but her eyes softened slightly. As she turned away, the weight of the moment settled over her again. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. And whatever the judge's decision, she knew the implications would ripple far beyond the confines of that courtroom. As the courtroom filled back up after the recess, a quiet but charged energy hung in the air. Elena sat calmly at her table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. On the surface, she looked as composed as ever, but inside, her thoughts churned. She had dealt with public scrutiny before. Her books and speeches had often put her in the spotlight. But this was different. This wasn't about her work or her voice. This was about her as a person, about a small, seemingly insignificant moment that had spiraled into something much larger. Marcus, still seated in the gallery, glanced at her occasionally, his face a mixture of worry and determination. He felt a deep need to see this through, to ensure that Elena received the justice she deserved. His earlier outburst had been impulsive, but he didn't regret it. There was something about Elena, something powerful and understated, that made him feel as if he'd been called to act. Meanwhile, Judge Whitman sat back at his bench, his expression as unreadable as before. Yet beneath his composed exterior, he was wrestling with his own thoughts. He had handled countless cases over the years, and most of them blurred together into a monotonous stream of legalities. But this case was different. It wasn't the fine or even the public interest surrounding Elena Carter that unsettled him. It was the deeper implications of what was unfolding in his courtroom. As the proceedings resumed, the tension in the room was palpable. The judge cleared his throat and addressed the court. "Before I deliver my ruling," he began, "I would like to hear more about the defendant's background. Ms. Carter, if you would, please tell the court about your work and its relevance to our community." Elena's eyes flickered with surprise. This wasn't something she had prepared for, but she understood the weight of the moment. Rising from her seat, she adjusted her blazer and stepped forward. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but thoughtful, "I've spent most of my life researching and documenting the history of our community. My work focuses on untold stories, on the lives and contributions of people who have been overlooked or erased by mainstream narratives." The courtroom was silent, all eyes fixed on her. Even Marcus seemed to lean forward, eager to hear more. Elena continued, her words deliberate. "I believe that understanding our history is essential, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. When we know where we come from, we can better navigate where we're going. My goal has always been to shine a light on the past, so that others can find strength and inspiration in it." Judge Whitman listened intently, his hand resting lightly on the gavel. He had expected a prepared speech, something polished and rehearsed. But Elena's words carried a raw sincerity that was impossible to ignore. "I don't see myself as exceptional," Elena added, her gaze sweeping the room. "I'm just one person trying to make a difference. And if this moment, this case, brings attention to the stories I've worked to preserve, then perhaps it's not a setback after all." The judge nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said. "You may be seated." As Elena returned to the seat, Marcus noticed a faint tremor in her hands. It wasn't fear, it was the weight of the moment, the realization that her words carried more significance than ever before. But the case wasn't over yet. Just as the judge was about to proceed, a figure stood up from the back of the courtroom. It was an older woman, her posture regal and her voice clear. "Your Honor," she said, "may I speak?" The room turned as one, murmurs of curiosity spreading like wildfire. Judge Whitman frowned but gestured for the woman to step forward. "State your name and your purpose," he said. "My name is Dr. Marilyn Hughes," she replied, her tone unwavering. "I'm a professor of African American Studies and a colleague of Miss Carter. I'm here to provide context about the significance of her work and why this case has struck such a chord." The judge hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You may proceed." Dr. Hughes turned to address the room, her voice resonant. "Elena Carter is not just an author or a historian. She's a cultural guardian. Her research has uncovered stories that have fundamentally changed the way we view our city's history. She's given voices to the voiceless, bringing dignity to those who were forgotten." The audience hung on her every word, the weight of her statements settling over the room. Dr. Hughes continued, her gaze steady. "What's happening here today is more than a legal matter. It's a reflection of how we value, or fail to value, those who dedicate their lives to preserving our shared humanity." Elena shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unused to such effusive praise. But Dr. Hughes wasn't finished. "Your Honor," she said, turning back to the judge, "I urge you to consider not just the letter of the law, but its spirit. Miss Carter's contributions have enriched us all. This case isn't just about her. It's about what kind of society you want to be." The judge's face remained stoic, but his fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the bench. He nodded curtly. "Thank you, Dr. Hughes," he said. "You may be seated." As Dr. Hughes returned to the seat, the tension in the room seemed to double. Elena glanced briefly at Marcus, who gave her a small, reassuring smile. Despite her misgivings about the attention, she couldn't deny the impact of what was unfolding. Judge Whitman straightened in his chair, his expression firm. "This court has heard compelling arguments today," he said, "and while my duty is to uphold the law, I am also bound to consider the broader implications of my rulings. I will take additional time to deliberate before issuing a final decision." The announcement sent a wave of murmurs through the crowd, but the judge raised his gavel sharply, silencing them. "This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning," he declared. As the room began to clear, Elena felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, unease, and a quiet determination. Whatever the outcome, she knew this moment was about more than a parking fine. It was a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone watching. And as she stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, she couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, the courthouse was more crowded than ever. Word about Elena Carter's case had spread beyond the city, and the gallery was filled with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Elena," and "Our History Matters." The air buzzed with anticipation, a collective sense that something important was about to unfold. Elena arrived early, accompanied by Marcus, who had insisted on being there for support. She hadn't wanted to make a spectacle of the situation, but the sight of people rallying behind her was both humbling and surreal. Marcus glanced at her as they approached the steps. "You ready for this?" he asked, his tone soft but firm. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitman sat silently at the bench, reviewing his notes. His demeanor remained composed, but his eyes betrayed a weariness that only a few in the room noticed. He had spent the night poring over Elena's case, rereading transcripts, and researching her work. What he found had unsettled him, not because it challenged the law, but because it challenged him. The bailiff called the court to order, and the murmurs in the gallery quieted instantly. Elena sat at her table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The judge cleared his throat and began. "This court reconvenes to address the matter of Ms. Elena Carter. I want to begin by acknowledging the broader implications of this case, which have become abundantly clear over the last 24 hours. A ripple of whispers spread through the audience, but a sharp glance from the judge silenced them. However, he continued, my role here is not to address public opinion but to determine a fair and just outcome based on the facts presented. The prosecution went first, reiterating their argument that the fine was a straightforward matter of law. The prosecutor, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention on the case, kept his statements brief and factual, avoiding any mention of Elena's public persona or the wider implications. It was a sterile clinical argument that contrasted sharply with the emotion filling the room. When it was Elena's turn to speak, she rose slowly, every movement deliberate. She didn't glance at the crowd or the cameras. Her focus was solely on the judge. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm but firm. I respect the law and this court's authority. I've never considered myself above the rules. I'm not asking for special treatment. What I'm asking for is understanding. She paused, letting her words sink in. Understanding that this case is about more than a fine. It's about the value we place on history, on culture, and on the people who work to preserve it. I spent my life trying to give voice to those who have been silenced. And now, it seems, I've become one of them. The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Judge Whitman's expression remained neutral, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. He gestured for her to sit, and she did so with quiet dignity. Just as the judge appeared ready to make a statement, the doors to the courtroom swung open, and a man entered, his appearance drawing a collective gasp from the gallery. It was Charles Adams, a prominent philanthropist and historian whose work was internationally recognized. He was known for funding projects that preserved cultural heritage, and his presence immediately elevated the stakes of the case. I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor, Adams said, stepping forward. But I felt it was imperative that I speak on behalf of Ms. Carter. The judge raised an eyebrow but allowed him to proceed. Adams turned to address the room, his voice commanding and passionate. Elena Carter's work is invaluable, not just to this city but to the world. Her research has uncovered truths that have shaped how we understand our past, and her voice has been a beacon for those who have felt forgotten. He paused, scanning the room before continuing. To penalize someone like her for a minor infraction, while ignoring the broader context of her contributions, would send a chilling message. It would tell every historian, every activist, and every cultural guardian that their work doesn't matter. And that, he said, his voice rising slightly, would be a tragedy. Elena felt her breath catch. She hadn't expected this, hadn't asked for it, but the weight of Adams' words brought tears to her eyes. Marcus glanced at her, his expression one of quiet pride. The judge, however, seemed unfazed by the display. Thank you, Mr. Adams, he said curtly. Your perspective is noted, but this court must still determine a ruling based on the law. Adams nodded respectfully and returned to his seat. The tension in the room was now palpable, every eye fixed on the judge. Elena's heart pounded as she awaited his decision, her mind racing with possibilities. Just as Judge Whitman opened his mouth to speak, a commotion broke out in the gallery. A young woman stood up, holding a copy of one of Elena's books. I'm sorry, Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling, but I need to say something. The judge's gavel slammed down, and the bailiff moved to escort her out. But Elena stood and raised her hand. Let her speak, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. The judge hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The young woman stepped forward, clutching the book tightly. This book saved my life, she said, her voice breaking. I was lost, disconnected from my heritage, from my identity. But Miss Carter's words helped me find myself again. She gave me a sense of belonging, a sense of pride. Her words sent a ripple through the room, and for the first time the judge's composure seemed to falter. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he processed everything unfolding before him. The weight of the moment was undeniable, the stakes higher than ever. Elena sat down, her hands trembling. She had come to court expecting to face a simple legal matter, but now it felt as if the entire world was watching. As the judge called for a brief recess, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew the next moments would determine far more than the outcome of a parking fine. They would shape the narrative of what justice truly meant. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs during the recess. Reporters whispered into microphones, onlookers exchanged theories, and Eleanor sat quietly, lost in thought. Marcus leaned over, his voice low. You okay? This is turning into something none of us expected. Elena gave a small nod. I'm fine. I don't know where this is heading. She glanced at the judge's empty bench, her mind spinning. The overwhelming support had touched her deeply, but it also felt like the weight of the world was pressing on her shoulders. She had come to court to deal with a fine, not to become the face of a cause. As the minutes ticked by, the courtroom door opened again, and Judge Whitman returned, his face unreadable. The bailiff called for silence, and everyone took their seats. Just as the judge prepared to resume proceedings, a tall man in a dark suit strode into the room. His entrance was commanding, and the murmurs in the gallery quickly died down. "Your Honor," the man began, addressing the bench with practiced authority. "My name is Arthur Calloway, and I represent the State Historical Preservation Society. I believe my presence here is both relevant and necessary." The judge frowned slightly but allowed him to speak. Calloway turned to face the room, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on Elena. "Miss Carter," he began, "your work is indeed remarkable. However, there are aspects of your research and acquisitions that raise serious concerns that may have legal implications." A sharp gasp echoed through the courtroom, and Elena's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected this, an attack not just on her integrity but on her life's work. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. Calloway adjusted his tie, his expression grave. "While reviewing your public records, we found instances where historical artifacts were obtained without proper documentation or permissions. This raises questions about the legitimacy of some of your findings and whether certain items should rightfully belong to the communities you claim to represent." The room erupted in whispers, and Elena's face turned pale. Marcus immediately leaned toward her. "This is a smear campaign," he whispered angrily. "They're trying to discredit you." Judge Whitman banged his gavel, calling for order. "Mr. Calloway," he said sternly, "do you have evidence to support these claims, or is this an attempt to derail these proceedings?" Calloway held up a folder. "Your Honor, I have documentation that suggests irregularities in Ms. Carter's methods. I request that these matters be considered before any decisions are made regarding her case." Elena's heart pounded as the judge took the folder, his expression hardening as he skimmed the pages. She could feel the eyes of the room boring into her, a mix of sympathy and suspicion. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. Her entire reputation was being called into question. "I don't believe this," Elena said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. She stood, her hands trembling but her gaze fierce. "Every artifact I've worked with has been carefully researched and obtained through legitimate channels. My work has always been about honoring history, not exploiting it." Calloway's face remained impassive. "Intentions aside, Ms. Carter, the law requires transparency and accountability. Without proper documentation, your claims are, at best, questionable." The judge held up a hand, silencing them both. "This court is not the venue for debating historical preservation practices. However," he added, his tone sharp, "these allegations complicate the matter significantly. I'll need time to review this evidence before proceeding." Elena sat down, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what was happening. The fine, the public scrutiny, and now this, an attack on her character and her life's work. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said firmly, but even he looked unsettled. Outside the courtroom, the crowd had grown, and the atmosphere was electric with speculation. Reporters shouted questions as people debated the new developments. Some defended Elena passionately, while others began to question everything they had admired about her. Back inside, the judge called for a second recess, and Eleanor was escorted to a private room. She paced nervously, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and frustration. "This isn't just about me," she said aloud, turning to Marcus. "If they discredit my work, they're discrediting the history of countless people who deserve to be remembered." Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "And that's exactly why they're doing it. They know what's at stake." Before they could continue, there was a knock at the door. A young woman stepped in, her face flushed with urgency. "Miss Carter," she said quickly, "I'm a researcher who's worked with some of the artifacts in question. If you need help proving their legitimacy, I can provide documentation." Elena stared at her, a glimmer of hope breaking through the storm. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "That could make all the difference." But as the woman handed over a stack of papers, Marcus frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, sensing his unease. "These documents," he said slowly, flipping through them. "They're helpful, but they don't cover everything. There are still gaps. If Calloway digs deeper, he'll find more ways to twist this against you." Eleanor sunk into a chair, her hope fading. The stakes had never been higher, and the path forward seemed impossibly steep. As the courtroom prepared to reconvene, she knew she was heading into the fight of her life, one that would determine not just her future, but the legacy she had spent her entire life building.